Hello guys, this is What About Nintendo. Today I'm here for another Zelda Breath of the Wild sequel video. In this video I'm going to be analyzing and comparing the graphics for the sequel versus the original Breath of the Wild and showing you everything that's been improved to this engine. So let's get right on into it. Let's start with resolution and frame rate. First off, I'd like to say that this game is running at an unknown resolution at the moment at 30 frames per second. So I say unknown because no matter how hard I tried to pixel count this game, well, I just couldn't find any clean edges at all. I tried to pixel count the trailer, but the trailer appeared to be heavily anti-aliased. It could be that the trailer is just heavily compressed, but that seems very unlikely since it doesn't seem to have that typical blotchy, blurry, broken up, discolored look that YouTube compression has. It's still fairly pixel perfect, and none of the trailers to the original Breath of the Wild are hard to pixel count at all, and all the other E3 trailers are super easy to pixel count as well. Obviously there is compression. This is a trailer ripped from YouTube with a lot of dark areas. Compression abounds. But in the brightly lit areas where you'd think an accurate pixel count could be taken, where there doesn't seem to be much compression at all, alas, the pixels appear to be averaged out too much to count properly. So it would seem, but not 100% guaranteed, that this game may have some pretty nice anti-aliasing, which would surprise me because Nintendo seems to hate that effect for whatever reason. But if it is in the game, I'd be very happy. And as for frame rate, the trailer is indeed running at 30 frames per second. However, it could just be that it's encoded at 30 and the full game may run at 60, but I highly doubt it knowing the specs of the system. But we don't know what's possible with a Switch Pro down the line, so I won't count that possibility out. But for now, what we know is that it's running at 30 frames per second. For the rest of this video, I have segmented the trailer into two sections, the underground section and the above ground Hyrule Field section. Let's start with the underground section, as it is obviously the biggest part of the trailer. The first thing I noticed was the higher polygon count. The polygon count in Breath of the Wild is exceptionally low, with objects and environments typically lacking that round, detailed, high poly look you come to expect in modern games. However, in the sequel, we see that the polygon count seems to be much higher. Either luminous stones have a complete redesign, or there's a similar rock with a much more detailed polygonal look. I'm betting that it's actually the former. Luminous stones have gotten a redesign, and well, they do look a lot better, as you can see here. And it's not just the luminous stones themselves that you notice. Right away, just looking at these stones, you notice that the rocks surrounding those stones also have a lot of detail and a high polygon count in comparison to what we see in Breath of the Wild. There's a bunch of other things that have higher polygon counts as well. High polygon shores, high polygon count stairs, high polygon count bricks, exceptionally high poly pillar in the water. Just look at all the polygons making up this ornate bridge. It is stunning. There's just so many things that have a much higher polygon count in this game. The ornate walls in this cavern have many polygons that would have most likely been a mostly flat texture in Breath of the Wild. And this strange temple-like entrance is also full of polygonal detail that is typically flat in the original game. In fact, similar Zonai ruins in Breath of the Wild are far less detailed, like the Zonai ruins in Faron Woods, which actually closely resemble that of the entrance we see in the sequel trailer. However, in Breath of the Wild we see far less detail. Or take this maze for example. The walls are flat with simple 2D textures to represent these pillars jutting from the walls. Or this chunk that's missing from the wall in this scene is represented with polygons instead of just a texture, unlike the chunks missing from the walls in the Zonai maze and elsewhere in the game. Now in Breath of the Wild there are also some areas which have similar looking detail, but for the most part things are represented by flat textures. Another thing I noticed is that the entire lighting engine seems to have been revamped. For one, the amount of shadow casting light objects has been greatly increased. For example, in the trailer we see tons of shadows being cast from the characters and environments from the torches that are shining on them. In Breath of the Wild, your torch will not cast shadows from you or any objects in the environment. Notice in this footage I grabbed how the light is actually appearing behind these boxes that are in front of the torch, which should be completely encased in shadows. Also, on the topic of torches, more torches have particles than in Breath of the Wild. In Breath of the Wild, the only torch that will release particles is your own, but in this game we see multiple torches releasing particles at once. But back to shadows. This is something that doesn't just apply to torches, but any dynamic light that isn't the sun. These could illuminate areas in Breath of the Wild, but they wouldn't cast shadows. However, in this game, it does. We see the glowstone that is prominently featured throughout the trailer casting shadows onto the environment. We see the malice itself cast shadows. In this scene with the rat, we see the malice turning the rat's shadow from a very diffuse shadow to a very sharp shadow, and even casting shadows from itself under the stone stairway. Even the green Gerudo text swirling around the room is casting lights and shadows onto the stone leading up to where Ganon is being sealed. I also noticed that the ambient occlusion is much better. While screen space ambient occlusion is in Breath of the Wild, it is a very low resolution, the draw distance on it is terrible, and it's a very subtle effect. This game seems to have a much higher resolution ambient occlusion, see how much less shimmering there is, and it's much darker. For example, the shadows filling in the gaps between geometry in this ornate wall, or the ambient occlusion on these rocks leading up to Ganon's corpse. Overall, this means caves are much darker. In Breath of the Wild, caves are very bright, even if there's no light source at all. Since most of Breath of the Wild's shadows are dependent on the sun, there's just not really that many shadows, so the area remains just as if you were under some shade, and not really like you're in a completely dark cavern. In the sequel, we see there are way more shadows than before, and the cave looks suitably dark, but also really shows off the light from the luminous stones and the torches, which looks absolutely beautiful. The next thing I notice is the texture quality of the game is much better than the original game. Texture quality is significantly higher in this game than in the original. For example, we can see how much higher texture detail is on that pillar I mentioned earlier in the video. The texture on the close-up of the wall also looks great in this scene. And the textures on the brickwork throughout the entirety of the trailer is really a step up from anything we see in Breath of the Wild. And these are super close-up shots too. Even on close inspection, these textures are holding up rather nicely. Texture filtering also seems to be enabled, which wasn't the case of Breath of the Wild or its cutscenes, or at least it wasn't very strong. Next up is material work. On top of texture and polygon detail, another thing I noticed that was greatly improved was the actual materials of those objects. For example, those stone stairs look like they're made from rock, and have the proper reaction to light that you would expect. In Breath of the Wild, stone looked more plasticky and fake, and not really like actual stone, and didn't really react to light in the way you would think stone should. This was in part due to its low polygon count and smooth look, with the lack of specularity that the stone had in Breath of the Wild, but this is also due to the great material work upgrades in the game that are just that much better. And finally, I noticed that clothes do not clip as much in this game. In Breath of the Wild, that same Hylian hood Link uses in the sequel trailer will clip through your sword and shield, but it doesn't do that in this game. And before you guys run out and say, oh, well maybe they just fixed it because this seems to be a cutscene, well no, there are plenty of cutscenes in Breath of the Wild where we see clipping on clothing and other objects, so that doesn't seem to be the case. But that's it for the underground segment. Let's talk about that outside Hyrule Field segment now. Nintendo sure did pick a tricky time of day with this one, with tons of sun glare and fog and just tons of post-processing effects that make it really hard for comparisons, but I did end up finding some differences. Firstly, that the trees in the game actually seem to have better draw distance than before. Initially, I actually thought the tree placement might be different from the original slightly, but then I just noticed that the trees looked fuller at a distance than they do in the original game. In fact, if we zoom in, we can see that the leaf structure differs between the two, with the leaf in the sequel looking more detailed. This is even on trees that are close enough to be pretty much fully rendered, so I think it's likely this is an upgrade to the actual models as well as an upgrade to draw distance. It's a tough detail to notice in the trailer, but a change like this will be much more noticeable in actual gameplay scenarios. However, from what we can see of trees very far in the distance, they appear to load in exactly the same, which is fine since they loaded extremely far in the original anyways. But that's not the only change to draw distance I noticed. I also noticed that there were some changes to the actual geometry of the map itself. Here in these mountains on the left side of the screen, we see a much higher detail with far more polygons being rendered and the mountain being much closer to its actual shape. It just looks so much better than the original, which was a very, very low poly, very low detail model. That would of course exchange out for better models as you got closer. This seems to actually render out better models at a distance than the original game. Now, one thing I did notice that I wanted to point out, because I'm not sure if it's actually due to draw distance or an artistic change, but I thought I'd mention it either way. In Breath of the Wild, there were mountains in the background you could see, but not go to, but they appear to be missing in this trailer. Well, maybe not missing, they're just tiny now, as we can see a very small mountain sticking out in the background still. And it's not just the sun glare covering things up, since we can see all the other mountains in the distance, and as I said, that little mountain I mentioned before. This could hint that they're changing those generic mountain ranges to actually be fully explorable in this new game. But then I decided to actually go and check this out further, and I noticed that Breath of the Wild 2 actually renders them closer to their actual look than Breath of the Wild 1, and that's why they're different. In the original Breath of the Wild, they are drawn in as basic mountain shapes, but they don't actually look like that at all. If you go to Hero Mountains and look at them, they're much more flat and rounded like in Breath of the Wild 2. Perhaps they're rendering them properly just to increase the draw distance, or maybe they're giving them more detail because they're areas you can actually travel to. Either way, this is a difference I noticed, so I wanted to point it out to you guys. Another difference that has implications on both the graphical and possibly the story and exploration side of things is that the sun seems to be rising from the north. In the trailer, we see the sun in a position that is very odd, making it look like it's actually rising from the north. I decided to track the sun from sunrise to sunset, and the sun is never in that location in Breath of the Wild. It doesn't even make any sense, as obviously the sun rises from the east and not the north. And this does seem to be the sun rising, as it's very low on the horizon. It's giving off that shade and look that we get when the sun's rising, as opposed to that very red, purpley look that we see when the sun is setting. I don't know why the change. Maybe it's for cinematic reasons, maybe it's so the sun glare is in a way that covers up parts of the map so we can't see everything. I'm not really sure, but either way, it definitely made getting comparisons for this game much, much harder, so thanks Nintendo for that one. And last but not least, the shadow quality is definitely better in the overworld. Speaking of the sun, we see some great shadow work in this game compared to Breath of the Wild. I mentioned a lot about shadow quality in the previous segment, and well, the outside world does not disappoint. We can't see as much in this shot as we can in the underground areas, but there's still some things to be pointed out. In Breath of the Wild, the shadow maps are distant objects with either very approximate or non-existent, with only very, very large objects like mountains really casting correct shadows from the sun. This game handles it better though, allowing smaller objects to cast shadows this time around. For example, this hill is actually casting a shadow on the ground behind it, and we see shadows cast by this broken wall as well. This never happens at any time of day in Breath of the Wild, trust me, I checked. These shadows add more depth to the landscape and overall make the game look less flat. We see the same thing with larger trees and stumps casting shadows. However, smaller trees still don't cast a shadow at a distance. Of course, forests had shadows in Breath of the Wild, as you can clearly see, but the shadows were more approximated and didn't really line up properly with the actual environment at all. Now the shadows in the sequel don't line up perfectly either. They're slightly off if you zoom in close, but it's still much better than the original game, and you don't really notice unless you zoom in on the image. They're also better impacted by the direction and position of the sun. In Breath of the Wild, not all distant shadows accurately change to represent the sun's position in the sky. As you can see in this shot, even though the sun is shining from the right of this forest, the shadows actually act as if it's straight ahead, with light streaming in from the front down to the bottom when light should be streaming more left to right. But in the Breath of the Wild sequel trailer, we see the light and shadows are accurately aligned to the direction of the sun and how high it is in the sky. So there you have it, folks. Those are the differences I noticed. Now in time, I'm sure even more differences will come to light, and the exact nature of these differences will be more noticeable as we get more and more gameplay, but this is what I had to give you for now. But I want to hear if you guys in the comments notice anything for yourself. Let me know down in the comments below, and let me know what you think of all of the different details that I pointed out in this video. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and ring that bell icon for notifications of all my videos, because you're not going to want to miss the tons more Zelda Breath of the Wild sequel content and other Nintendo-themed content I have coming out on this channel. Also, make sure to share this video with everybody you know who's hyped for the Breath of the Wild sequel. I'll see all you awesome people later on What About Nintendo. Bye!